Hello, my online learners, and welcome to part 2 of the respiratory system. When I left you last, we just got into the nose. So your nose warms, cleans, and moisturizes your air. Then when you come down, it will join the air with where your mouth comes in. This is because your nose is so good at warming and cleaning. This is why it's better to be a nose breather than a mouth breather. If you only breathe through your mouth, your air isn't getting as warmed and moistened, and that's why you sometimes get a sore throat when you breathe through your mouth. Now, do realize you do have your tonsils here. Just so if you are a mouth breather, there's a way to kind of clean it by having any white blood cells in your tonsils, kind of find an area. Okay, as I was talking about, when you swallow, your tongue pushes on the epiglottis, which closes the area to your trachea. And we talked briefly about the vocal cords. Now notice the esophagus, the food tube, goes behind the trachea. And when we look at it, the esophagus can actually bulge into the trachea because the trachea has these C-shaped cartilages. Okay, there's a lot of information in your textbook that you really don't need to know much about. Just kind of a general idea. Sebum traps the particles. That's a fancy way of saying oil and mucus. We talked about the olfactory region being in the top of your mouth. We talked about, don't worry about this or columnar cells. Okay, one thing I want you to be aware of is that you do have mucus, and you probably don't realize it until you get a cold and then you get all phlegmy and nasty. But the mucus is there, and it's in 2 layers. Basically, the mucus is there to be sticky and to trap particles. It's also there for a little bit of lubrication, but it's more for being sticky. Okay? And you may notice that when you get really, when you have a lot of mucus or dirt or something, you get that, and then you know, cough up a nasty one, basically. Okay, so I just want you to be aware of the fact that there are goblet cells that produce mucus. There are all these different glands in your throat, so it's not necessarily just a basic tube going down, but there's some structure in it. More detail than you need to know. Good. You also have sinuses, which are air spaces. Just want you to be aware they exist. Then there are 3 parts of the pharynx, which I think is far too much labeling. Just know that there's a pharynx, and then the pharynx goes down to the larynx, and then the larynx goes to the trachea. Good. Talked about the trachea. The larynx is the vocal cords. We talked about those. And it's the vocal cords, they say, that's dividing the air passages. The trachea, we talked about the C-shaped cartilage. We talked about the how the trachea will then branch off to the left and right bronchus. Now here's a good picture to show how the left lung only has 2 lobes, and that's because the heart goes right here. The right lung has more room, so it has 3 lobes. A lot of details. I just want you to realize the bronchus has muscles on it, and that's what will contract. And in asthma, this is what will contract, making it hard to breathe. Just want you to realize it's there. I'm not going to have you name it, but realize that this isn't just a basic tube. You've got your epithelium, you've got muscles, you've got smooth muscle, you've got a good blood supply, and you have your cartilage. But all of this is too thick that the air won't actually diffuse, or the gases won't diffuse at this point. Okay, it's not till, so let's go down to the bronchioles. At the level of the bronchioles, it'll divide and divide and divide, and then there is no cartilage, and that's when you have the bronchioles. Then it divides again, and you have an alveolar duct, and the alveolar duct will lead to the alveoli, and the alveoli are these air sacs, and they say that if you were to take your alveoli and stretch them all out, you would have a surface area of 80 meters squared. So that is either the surface area of a tennis court or a sail. I don't know. They always give me these great big things. Anyway, it's big, but it's all squished up because of all this folding and these lung sacs. Now, I don't know if you've realized it, but sometimes, like a very good example is a plastic bag would stick to each other. Your lung sacs are moist, so you need a chemical called surfactant. And surfactant will break up that surface tension of the air and stop them from sticking to each other and by decreasing the surface tension. And this is very important to prevent overall expansion of the alveoli and to also keep the alveoli open. You need to have good surface area for good gas exchange. Lack of surfactant will stiffen the lungs. And quite often, since surfactant is developed late in fetal development, preemies often don't have adequate surfactant levels because it's kind of the last thing since you're not using the lungs. So usually it'll come with time and age, but quite often that's why you need to monitor preemies' respiratory, is to make sure they have the surfactant. Okay. So here we have an example of the alveoli. There's all these zones. Don't worry about them. Just realize that alveoli is where it is a single cell thin, and that will allow for efficient diffusion of gases in and out. You also have a very good blood supply. And it's because of this blood supply that quite often if there's any extra fluid in the lungs, it will go into the blood supply. Or if you have any problem with your blood pressure, it will push fluid into the lungs. So it's a very unique dynamic equilibrium. Okay? Good. The alveolar membrane is thin. You don't need to know all the different detail about it. Just realize it's thin. And it has a very good blood supply. We talked about the type 2 cells. The type 2 cells produce factant, or we talked about surfactant. You don't need to know about 1 or 2, but do realize that surfactant is a very important molecule, and it kind of acts like a soapy molecule to keep the tissue from sticking together. And if you don't know what I mean, take a plastic bag, and when you wash the plastic bag, there is water inside and it'll stick together. So you actually have to take the effort to fluff it up. But if you put a little soap in that plastic bag, it doesn't stick together. So that's what surfactant does. It's very important to keep healthy, active alveoli. Okay. Don't worry about all the different types of cells and the space. Okay. Blood, you know from the last unit that blood from the right part of the heart enters the lungs. Good. Gas exchange takes place. Now, you will have any barriers to gas exchange. You prevent something usually with surface area or thinness. So if you decrease the amount of oxygen, you can't absorb it. If you have any secretions, such as mucus or buildup or pus in your lungs, it will interfere with diffusion too. Remember when we talked about the red blood cells, we talked about hemoglobin is the the protein in the cells that picks up the oxygen and helps transport around. You need a good blood supply and a good oxygen supply. If there isn't enough oxygen, it will tell the kidneys, actually. The kidneys will detect it and will tell the bone marrow to make more blood cells. Good. Lots of stress. Now, the best thing that monitors the breathing level is the carbon dioxide levels, not oxygen. It's carbon dioxide, and that's due to the fact that the carbon dioxide actually changes the pH of the blood if there's too much of it. Without getting into too much chemistry, it forms carbonic acid. Okay? Talk about it at another level. But right now, carbon dioxide monitors the levels and the ventilation. I've talked also at the beginning of the last lecture how carbon dioxide can be moved out of the lungs by increasing your breathing rate, but that change of the pH can also be regulated by the kidneys, which we'll get to in the next unit when we talk about kidneys. Okay. Now, when you breathe in and out, it has to do with the fact that you have your ribs. Your ribs are have a pleura, which are two linings. It's a double lining. So your pleura is a membrane that will stick to your ribs, and then you have an interpleural space, and then you have an inside pleura which sticks to the lungs. So you have this is what keeps your lungs basically stuck to your rib cage, is the pleura, and there's an interpleura space in there which has mucus in it, and it should not have air in it. If air gets in there, this is what will cause your lungs to collapse. So you normally just have a little mucus to keep it stuck together, and also for lubrication when you breathe in and out. So you have your parietal pleura, your pleural cavity, your visceral pleura. It sticks to the lungs. Now realize here is your diaphragm. Very important when we talk about the mechanism of breathing, the diaphragm and the ribs. So when we look at them, you don't worry about this. Lots of detail here. Okay, when it comes to breathing, we talked about the respiratory center being in the medulla oblongata. And so that will send signals to your phrenic nerve. Inspiration is an active process where your diaphragm gets a signal, your muscles in your ribs get a signal. When we look at it, it's a very active process. The diaphragm, so what happens is your diaphragm contracts lowering. Your diaphragm contracts, and as a result, it lowers. Your chest, where your rib cage, will contract. The muscles in your ribs will contract, and that will raise your rib cage up. So the process of lowering the diaphragm and raising the rib cage increases the volume of your chest cavity. When you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. And then because the pressure outside is greater, it will draw air into your lungs. So air is actually sucked into your lungs. It's not like a balloon where you blow air into your lungs. By increasing your rib cage, you create lower pressure and air is drawn in. And this is an active process because all your muscles are stimulated. Now, when you go to exhale, what happens is in normal exhalation, just resting exhalation, your muscles lose the stimuli. So your diaphragm will relax, your rib cage will relax. As your diaphragm moves up and your rib cage moves down, it will decrease the volume of your chest cavity, and that will push the air out. That's in normal breathing. In forced expiration, you will actually use accessory muscles. You will use more muscles. So you use your neck, you use your chest muscles, and that's to do the, okay? Just normal breathing when I'm sitting here, you just relax. But forced muscles, you have to use extra. So while expiration is normally passive, which means it's resting, it doesn't take energy. The muscles just stop being stimulated. If you are forcing it, you need your accessory muscles to increase your abdominal pressure. Okay? Good. And here just shows all the extra muscles to help you breathe. Then there's functioning tests. Okay, when you look at, where's the diagram? So here is the volume, and this is really quite confusing, but it's basically just a straightforward measurement. So tidal volume is the in and out of your normal breath, just like the tides come in and go. Your inspiration volume is when you go and take extra in, and then your expiration is to force it all out. All of that is your vital lung capacity. Now realize there is a volume at the bottom of your lungs that does not get the gases exchanged, and that's your residual volume. So tidal volume, inspiration reserve, expiration reserve, residual volume, and total lung capacity. Make sure you know those terms. Then it goes into a lot of information on diseases. Basically with lung diseases, you can't get the air in or you can't get it across. And that's enough for now. And that's the end of part 2. We're done respiration. Thanks.